The frozen winds of Sestris 9 whipped through the desolate landscape, sending sharp gusts of icy air that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The planet had become a frozen wasteland, where no life could endure the storm's fury. The sky was a swirling vortex of white and grey, like an endless blizzard that refused to relent beneath the storm's wrath. The jagged ice formations stood like ancient sentinels, silent and unmoving, their surfaces reflecting the dim light from the distant sun that barely pierced through the chaos above the ground. The storm danced across the plains, leaving no trace of warmth, no sign of comfort, only death and cold. And in the midst of all this, a small alien child huddled in the snow, her skin an unnatural shade of translucent blue, barely visible against the harsh white of the landscape, her eyes wide and filled with terror as she wept. The cold had already started to freeze her tears, turning them to fragile shards of ice that clung to her face, her small frame shivering against the onslaught of the storm. She curled tighter into a ball, wrapping her tiny arms around her knees, trying to hold on to whatever warmth was left. But it was not enough. She could feel the ice creeping into her bones, the chill of the storm wrapping itself around her fragile form like a death sentence. The wind howled louder, almost mocking her helplessness. Her breath came out in visible clouds of vapor that quickly vanished into the wind, as though they never existed. With each exhale, her life seemed to fade a little more, her body growing numb, her mind slipping in and out of consciousness. The loneliness of the wasteland felt all-encompassing as she sat there abandoned in the snow, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She didn't know how long she had been there. She didn't know how long she had been alone. She only knew that the storm wouldn't stop, it wouldn't end, and that she wouldn't survive if someone didn't come for her, someone to save her, someone to pull her from this frozen nightmare. But there was no one coming, no one in sight, just the vast emptiness of the ice world that stretched on forever. As she sat and wept, the storm continued its relentless assault, the cold devouring her warmth, her tiny body now barely able to move, her skin growing colder with each passing second. The wind whipped around her like a living creature hungry for her life. As the sky darkened further and the temperature continued to plummet, it seemed as if the storm would claim her soul. Before the night ended, the child's sobs became weaker until they stopped altogether, replaced by the silence of her frozen stillness. In the distance, far beyond where the child sat, the faintest flicker of movement broke the monotony of the white world. A figure emerged out of the storm, a human figure struggling against the icy wind, his steps unsteady as he battled the harsh weather. A soldier, someone from another world, sent to this forsaken place. And for the first time since the storm began, the child's silent gaze turned toward the approaching figure, her eyes no longer filled with only fear, but with a glimmer of hope, as if this stranger might be her salvation. The soldier fought against the storm with every step, the wind howling around him, trying to push him back, every gust an enemy in itself. He could barely see through the freezing mist that clung to his visor, his thermal suit providing little comfort against the intensity of the cold. His hands felt numb, his face stinging with each breath. He could hardly feel his feet as he trudged forward, slipping on the slick ice beneath him. But there was something guiding him, something pulling him through the chaos, a faint signal, a signal he had been tracking since the crash, a distress beacon, weak, but still alive, flickering like a fragile flame in the overwhelming darkness of the storm. He had followed it for hours now, and with every step closer, he grew more certain that this world would claim more lives before the end of the night. He had to reach whoever was out there, or they would perish too. The terrain had become unforgiving, sharp ridges and frozen crevices that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Each step took him deeper into the abyss of the storm. But the signal pushed him on. Though it had faltered once or twice, it was still there. And it was leading him somewhere. It wasn't until he nearly lost his footing on a particularly steep slope that he noticed something out of place in the distance, a small figure barely visible against the white of the storm, a fragile shape sitting in the snow, unmoving. The figure didn't seem to belong here. Its silhouette was too slight, too delicate to be a survivor of this planet. He squinted his eyes through the icy fog. His heart skipped a beat when he realized it was a child, an alien child. She was curled into a ball, her body frozen in place, her skin a dull blue beneath the frozen tears that had crusted on her face. He didn't think he could make it through the storm much longer. But this changed everything. He couldn't leave her there. The instinct to protect surged within him. In an instant he pushed forward through the blinding snow. With a strength born of desperation, he had only one goal now: to reach her and keep her alive. He couldn't fail her, not like this, not in this world. The storm was growing angrier each passing moment, as if warning him that his effort was futile. But the thought of the child alone in the ice spurred him on. The wind cut against his face like 1,000 needles. But he hardly noticed anymore. All he could think about was getting to her as quickly as possible. When he reached her, his breath caught in his throat. The child was no longer moving. She was still, but her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, as if clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Her tears had frozen to her skin, and the sight of it made his stomach twist with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of protectiveness that went beyond the duty. He had been trained for something deeper, something human. He knelt beside her, his movements careful as he reached out and lifted her from the snow. The moment his hands touched her freezing skin, he felt the shock of cold rush through him, his teeth clenched. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped her in his arms, cradling her against his chest. He couldn't wait any longer. They needed shelter now, or both of them would die. The storm rolled around them as Elias held the child close, his own breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his heart pounding in his chest with fear and desperation. He could feel her small body trembling in his arms, her skin cold to the touch, colder than anything he had ever experienced. It was as if she was made of ice herself, her body too frail for this planet, too fragile for the harshness of the world. They were on. The wind howled louder, and Elias tightened his grip around her, not caring that the cold was seeping into his own bones. He couldn't let go, not now. Not when she was so close to death. He had to get her out of here. He had to find shelter. He couldn't fail her. The storm seemed to mock him every step. He took each gust of wind a reminder of how hopeless this place was, how unforgiving it could be. But Elias didn't let the storm defeat him. He pushed on through the ice and snow, moving with the child in his arms, his eyes scanning the horizon, desperately looking for any sign of shelter. The storm was relentless. But Elias had been through worse. His training had prepared him for situations like this, though nothing could have prepared him for this alien world, for the frozen desolation that stretched out in every direction, and the child in his arms, whose life was slipping away with every passing second. He couldn't let her die out here, not like this. He had to keep moving. He had to keep searching with every step. He could feel his own strength beginning to fade, his vision blurring from the cold, his hands aching from the effort. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The child's breath was shallow against his chest, her tiny body growing more limp with every moment. Elias could feel the weight of her life pressing down on him, the responsibility too heavy for any one person to bear. But he didn't have a choice. He had to keep going. He had to make it. He knew that the longer they stayed out here, the less chance they had of surviving. But there was nothing else to do but push on. So he pushed through the storm with the last of his strength, his body fighting against the cold that seemed to grow fiercer with each step. The wind screamed in his ears, but Elias didn't hear it anymore. All he could hear was the beating of his own heart and the sound of the child's labored breath against his chest. And then he saw it, a shadow ahead, something dark against the white expanse of the storm, a cave or some form of shelter. It was hard to tell through the blizzard, but it was something. Elias's heart surged with hope, and he pushed forward with renewed determination, his legs burning for exhaustion, his breath ragged in his chest. But he didn't stop, not now, not when they were so close. The entrance to the shelter grew larger as he drew nearer. It wasn't much, but it was enough to protect them from the storm, long enough for him to warm the child, enough to keep her alive. Just a little longer. He reached the entrance with his last bit of strength and collapsed inside, barely able to keep his grip on the child as they tumbled into the small cave that offered them a fragile sanctuary from the storm, the cold wind still howling outside. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias allowed himself to breathe. The cave was small, just a hollow in the rock, barely large enough for the two of them to fit. But it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. Elias collapsed against the stone wall, his arms still holding the child tightly to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. The cold still gripped at his bones, but the wind had stopped its furious assault, and for the moment they were safe. but only just he could feel the child's small form against him, her body still cold as ice, her breath weak and shallow, every movement a struggle. But Elias refused to let go. He refused to believe it was too late. The cave was dim, the only light coming from the weak glow of his suit's emergency lights. But it was enough to see the child's fragile face, her translucent skin, even paler than before her eyes were closed, and her body lay completely still. The frozen tears that had once clung to her face had begun to melt, leaving tiny rivulets of water in their wake. Elias reached down with trembling hands and gently wiped the remnants of ice from her skin. His fingers brushed against her cold cheek, and he felt a pang of guilt. His mind raced with thoughts of what more he could have done, what more he could still do. He had saved her from the storm. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the cold had already claimed her, her alien physiology, beyond his understanding, her body a mystery to him, beyond the simple knowledge he had of survival? The child shifted slightly, her small form barely moving, but it was enough to send a rush of relief through Elias. He wasn't too late yet. She was still alive. He could feel her chest rise and fall with each breath. Though they were faint and weak, he could still hear the soft rasp of her breath as she clung to life with all the strength she had left. Elias adjusted his position, pulling her closer into the warmth of his suit, trying to give her what little heat he could generate. He needed to get her warmer, to thaw the frost in her veins, to give her the chance to live. But he didn't have much time. The storm outside had taken everything from him, and he had nothing left to fight it with except his will and his determination to protect her. As he held her close, he noticed the faint shimmer in her eyes, the almost imperceptible glint of awareness beneath the cold and the exhaustion. She was still with him, still fighting against the storm's grip. He exhaled slowly, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And for the first time since he found her, he allowed himself to believe she might make it to see another day. Slowly, gently, Elias laid her on the cold stone floor of the cave and began to rummage through his emergency supplies. He had barely anything left, the basic survival kit, only enough for a few more hours. But it had to be enough. He tore open a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her body, making sure every inch of her was covered. His hands shook with the effort, but he didn't stop. He had to do this right. If he failed her now, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. As he finished wrapping her up, he activated his suit's last heat pack and pressed it against her tiny form, desperate for any warmth to seep through her frozen skin. But even with all he had left, he knew it might not be enough. The heat pack was doing its best, but it wasn't enough, not nearly enough. Elias could feel the cold still gripping at her skin. No matter how much he tried to warm her, he could see it in the way her chest barely rose and felt her body still limp in his arms. The child was fading, he knew it, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Not yet. Not when he had failed so many before. Not when he could still feel the weak pulse of her heart beneath his fingers. He had seen too many lives snuffed out by the harshness of battle and the unforgiving nature of the galaxy. And he wasn't going to let another life slip away on his watch. He wouldn't let her die in his arms, not after everything he had done to get here. He looked around the small cave in a panic. The world outside was a void, a wasteland of ice and storm. There was no shelter, no sanctuary beyond this small hollow. The storm had already claimed so many lives, and it would not stop until it had taken everything from this planet. But he couldn't let it take her. He couldn't let it take her like it had taken so many others. Elias's mind raced through every possible solution, his training coming to the forefront. But there was nothing here to help him, no high-tech tools, no medpacks or equipment to save her. All he had were his hands and his will to survive, and that would have to be enough. His heart hammered in his chest as he pressed his ear against her cold chest, willing himself to hear a heartbeat, to feel the tiniest sign of life. And for a fleeting moment, just as his hope began to crumble, he felt it, a faint rhythm beneath her skin, so weak, so delicate. But it was there, it was enough. Elias's hands trembled with relief as he slowly moved her back into his arms, once more her skin still cold. But at least she wasn't gone. She was still here, still fighting. He ran his fingers over her forehead and whispered quietly to her a language she wouldn't understand. But it didn't matter in that moment. The words were just a way to reach her, to remind himself that she wasn't alone. He wouldn't let her be alone. He wasn't sure how much longer they had, but he wasn't going to give up now. Not when he had come so far. He adjusted the thermal blanket around her and pulled her tighter against him, sharing his warmth, even if it meant he would suffer in return. They both needed heat, they both needed survival, and he wasn't going to let her freeze to death. In his arms he had to hold on a little longer. He had to fight through the exhaustion and the cold and the despair that threatened to drown him. He had to be her strength. When she had none left, Elias knew he wasn't the hero of some grand story. He was just a man stranded on a frozen planet with a child who wasn't supposed to be here, just like him. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was that she was still breathing, and he would keep her breathing. No matter the cost, he would fight through the storm, fight against the cold, and keep her alive long enough to get her to safety. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Elias felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he cradled the child in his arms, her small form still trembling against him. Despite the warmth he was trying to provide, he could feel her body growing heavier and her breath more shallow with each passing minute. The heat pack wasn't enough to thaw her completely, and every time he looked down at her, he saw the ice that still clung to her skin. The storm outside had receded for the moment, but the cold it had left behind still pressed in around them like a silent predator waiting for the right time to strike. Elias could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness of the cave, each thud reminding him of the urgency of the situation. He couldn't let her die here. He couldn't let her slip away. Not when she was so close to him, so fragile in his arms. He pulled her tighter against him, his own body protesting the effort. But he didn't care. Every second counted. The cold was still there, freezing her from the inside out, and he had to do something, anything, to get her warm again. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his supplies, barely enough to scrape by in a real emergency. But right now, that was all he had. He tore into the small packet of ration bars and swallowed one down quickly, without thinking. The food didn't help his immediate problem, but it kept him going, kept his strength up as he focused on the child, her tiny frame barely making an impression in his arms, so small, so delicate. He could feel the heat from his body warming her skin ever so slightly, but it wasn't enough. The reality of how little he had left to offer hit him harder than anything else. The child had to survive, the child had to live, and he had no idea how he could make that happen. He glanced around the cave again, still looking for anything to help him, a larger rock, a source of heat, some kind of shelter to keep him safe long enough for her body to recover. But there was nothing, no tools, no resources, just the same barren landscape of ice and stone that stretched endlessly outside. His only hope was to keep her warm long enough for her body to do the rest. He shifted position, pulling her into his lap, and wrapped his arms around her tighter, using his body to shield hers from the lingering cold of the cave and the dying warmth of the heat pack. He leaned his head against hers, hoping against hope that his body's warmth could keep her going just a little longer. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, all he could think of was his family back home on Earth, their faces, the warmth of their smiles, the peace of being with them in a world that didn't demand so much from him. His chest tightened with grief and longing, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. Not when this child's life hung in the balance. He focused on her instead, the slight rise and fall of her chest, the way her hands twitched occasionally, as though she could still feel the world around her. She was alive. She was still alive, and that meant there was still hope. He placed a trembling hand on her forehead and whispered again, not caring if she'd understand his words at this point. They were just a promise to her that he wouldn't leave her alone to die, that he would stay by her side, no matter how long it took, no matter how cold it got, no matter how much his own strength wore thin. He wouldn't leave, he wouldn't abandon her like so many had abandoned their own. He couldn't do that. He had made it this far, and he would keep going until they found a way off this hellish planet, or until she was strong enough to survive on her own. His own breath was coming in slow and steady gasps. Now his mind, focusing on the rhythmic sound of her heartbeats beneath his hand, he couldn't let up, not now. He had to keep her alive long enough to find help, long enough to get her to safety. And he knew that meant keeping her warm at all costs. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he would fight with everything he had to make sure that it was enough. As the minutes dragged on, Elias felt the strain of his own exhaustion, pushing him to the brink. His body was numb from the cold, his muscles sore from carrying the child, and the cave around them felt like a tomb closing in on them with each passing second. But he refused to succumb to the weight of despair. Not yet, not when there was still a chance that he could save her. He glanced down at the child in his arms. Her breathing was still faint, but at least it was steady, for now her small chest rising and falling slowly. The ice had mostly melted from her skin, but the chill still lingered beneath the surface, and Elias knew that if he didn't find a way to get her warmer soon, her survival would be in serious doubt. The reality of the situation was clear, and it wasn't a comforting thought. They were stranded on an alien planet, with no resources, no technology, no way of knowing how to get back to civilization. He had no answers, only a single goal: to keep his child alive long enough to escape this frozen hellhole and find help. But even that goal seemed almost impossible in this barren landscape. The storm had stopped for now, but the cold was still unrelenting, and the threat of another surge was ever-present. Elias looked at the walls of the cave, their jagged surfaces still glistening with frost and ice. Even here the planet's touch was unyielding. He sighed softly as he cradled the child closer. Her skin was still far too cold, but she wasn't slipping away, not yet. And that meant there was still hope. He knew he had to do something drastic to get them out of this situation, but he didn't know what he could possibly do. He couldn't build a fire. There was nothing around them to burn, no materials to generate heat. The thermal blanket he had wrapped around the child seemed to offer only a temporary solution, and the emergency heat packs were nearly depleted. There was nothing left to fight the cold, with nothing left but his own will and the sheer determination to survive. He closed his eyes and thought back to the crash, the burning wreckage of the ship, the reason he had been sent to this frozen wasteland in the first place. He had been looking for survivors, yet here he was a survivor himself, with no idea of how to find a way back home. He opened his eyes and looked at the child again, her face still pale, but her eyes were fluttering slightly as if she were beginning to regain some awareness. The faintest spark of life returned to her movements. Elias's heart leaped with hope, but he couldn't afford to get too comfortable. He couldn't let his guard down for even a second. He couldn't let her die here. He reached down and gently adjusted the blanket around her, making sure every part of her was covered, carefully holding her against his chest to share whatever warmth he could give her. But despite all of his efforts, it still wasn't enough. The child's body trembled ever so slightly in his arms, and Elias's heart sank. The reality hit him once again. There was no quick fix, no simple solution to get them out of this mess. But Elias was a soldier, a veteran of battles that were long since forgotten, and though this was a fight unlike any other he had faced, he refused to lose it. He refused to let the storm win. He had to think of something he needed to keep moving. He had to find shelter somewhere, find any kind of warmth, even if it meant walking back out into the storm to search for more supplies, or a way off this cursed planet. If he had to die in the process, then so be it. But he would not let this child die, not when he still had the will to fight left in him. His mind raced through every option, every idea, but it kept coming back to the same thing. The child needed warmth, the child needed hope, and Elias was the only one left who could give it to her. And that was enough for him. That was all he needed to keep going. Elias took a slow breath as he held the child tighter against him. The warmth of his body against hers was the only thing standing between her and the freezing death that had already claimed so much around them. Every second felt like an eternity, and though he was physically exhausted, his mind was still sharp, focused solely on one thing: keeping her alive. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it felt. He had nothing left to give her, no more resources, and no way of knowing how much longer he could survive in this cave with her. He glanced over his shoulder at the darkened entrance of the cave. The storm outside had stopped for now, but the wind still whistled eerily through the cracks in the rocks, and the cold was still there, wrapping around them like a vice, tightening with every passing moment. Elias knew they had to move. If they stayed in the cave, they wouldn't survive the next storm. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the next surge came, and it would bring with it the same ruthless fury as the last one. They couldn't afford to sit still. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. If they were going to make it out of this alive, they had to move now. As gently as he could, he shifted the child in his arms, his hands trembling as he carefully pulled her closer to him. She was still breathing, but her body was cold, still cold to the touch. Her skin too fragile, her small form too delicate for the unforgiving world they were trapped in. He thought of the wreckage of his ship, the twisted metal of the hull that had been torn apart in the crash. He had searched for survivors, but he had found nothing, only his own broken body and the wreckage of his hope. And yet here was this child, still alive, still hanging on against all odds, still fighting for a life she hadn't even asked for. Elias swallowed hard. He couldn't afford to fail her, not now. Not when she needed him the most, not when he had been given this one chance to make a difference. He closed his eyes for a moment as he held her against him, his breath coming in slow, steady bursts. And when he opened them again, his decision had been made. He wasn't going to stay here and wait for the storm to kill them. He was going to fight. He was going to take this child and walk into the storm again. If that's what it took, he didn't know where he was going. But he couldn't just sit here and hope for a miracle. He had to make his own miracles. The storm outside was raging again, but it was quieter now, not as strong as before, but still strong enough to send sharp gusts of freezing wind into the cave. Elias could feel the air biting at his skin and knew they couldn't stay here much longer. With a final look around the small shelter, he stood up, still cradling the child in his arms. His legs felt like they might buckle beneath him with every step. But he pushed through the fatigue and took the first step outside into the cold. The wind hit him hard like a slap to the face. But he didn't flinch, he didn't stop. The child was still with him, still breathing weakly, but alive, and that was enough for him to keep moving. Every step forward was a promise to her. Every step was one step closer to survival. And no matter what the storm had to throw at him, he wasn't going to stop, not until they found a way off this hellhole. No matter how much the world tried to break him or her, he was going to fight through it. He wasn't going to fail this child. He wasn't going to let the cold take her from him. Not while he still had the strength to carry her. The storm was unforgiving as Elias pushed forward, the wind biting at his exposed skin, the cold seeping into his bones. But he didn't let it stop him. He could feel the child's tiny body still trembling in his arms. But she was alive, still breathing shallow breaths against his chest. He focused on that, on the warmth of her skin against his, even as his own body started to give way to exhaustion. He had no plan, no direction. But he couldn't stop moving, not yet, not while she still needed him, not while she was still clinging to life. Elias's legs felt like lead with each step, his heart pounding in his chest as he navigated through the blinding snow, the world around him nothing but a blur of white and ice. But he kept moving, each step taking him further into the unknown, further away from the cave, and deeper into the frozen wilderness. He didn't know where he was going. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he kept walking, no matter how much the storm tried to force him back, no matter how much his body screamed for rest. He couldn't stop. The child needed him. She needed warmth and safety, and he had to find it somewhere, even if it meant dying in the process. He couldn't let her die. Not after everything they had gone through together. His breath was ragged as he trudged through the snow, his movements slower now. But he kept going, each step a battle against the storm and his own fatigue. He couldn't let up. He couldn't let himself fail again. The storm howled around them, the wind cutting through his clothes like knives. But Elias didn't stop. He gritted his teeth and pressed forward, each step harder than the last. But he was determined. He wouldn't stop, not now. He thought of the warmth of earth, of the family he'd left behind back home. But those thoughts couldn't distract him. Not now, not with this child's life in his hands. He thought of the mission, the crash, the pain, and the hopelessness that had followed. But now, it was all about survival. It was all about keeping the child alive and getting her out of this frozen hell. Elias' pace slowed even further as the cold took its toll on his body, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his fingers numb from the chill. But he didn't stop. His grip on the child remained firm. She was still alive, her small body barely stirring in his arms. But her heartbeat was there, faint and steady, and that kept him moving. It kept him going even when his own strength was slipping away. The storm seemed to be growing fiercer, the wind howling louder than before. But Elias didn't pay attention to it. He didn't let the storm win, not this time. Every time he felt himself falter, he thought of the child's life. And that was all he needed to keep pushing forward. Just a little longer. The wind pushed against him, trying to force him off course. But he was steady. He didn't let it stop him. He would carry her until he couldn't carry her anymore. He would get her to safety, or he would die trying. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, each one colder than the last. But then something changed, something he hadn't expected. He saw it through the snow ahead, a faint glow, barely visible, but unmistakable. A light in the distance. Hope had appeared. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, his eyes focused on the glow, and he staggered toward it, his body numb with exhaustion, but his mind sharp, his heart racing in anticipation. He wasn't sure what it was: a shelter, a ship, a building. He didn't care, as long as it meant warmth, as long as it meant a chance for the child to survive. He pushed himself harder with everything he had left, every muscle in his body aching with pain. But he didn't stop. The glow grew brighter, and as he neared it, he saw that it was a structure of some kind, a shelter hidden beneath the ice, a place of refuge. Just ahead, Elias couldn't believe it. He had found it. He had found a way to save them both. With the last of his strength, he made his way toward the entrance, stumbling through the snow, but never stopping, not until he reached the shelter and collapsed inside, clutching the child in his arms. He had made it. They had made it.